This is the conversation with Jeff Weiss. He's a journalist specializing in science and aviation, author, host of the Deep Dive MH370 podcast, and one of the leading journalists covering the disappearance of the Malaysian plane MH370. In this conversation, we discuss his motivations behind solving this case. We talk about the entire incident in detail. What facts do we know? What observations did we find? We talk about 3 plausible theories, why they work, why they don't work. And finally, we talk about how we can finally solve this case. This is no time. If you like what you see, then do hit subscribe on YouTube, follow on Spotify, rate 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. This project takes a lot of my time, money, and effort. So if you'd like to see it continue, do consider making a donation on Patreon, Anchor. You can buy a gift on Instagram Reels. You can buy super thanks on YouTube. You can become a member on YouTube. If not through monetary channels, then do consider sharing these episodes, leaving your likes and comments. All forms of engagement, they really go a long way. For other forms of love and support, you can follow this channel on Instagram or Twitter, or follow me personally.
Buonasera. And now is no time.
There is a saying, somewhere between the bottom of the climb and the summit is the answer to the mystery why we climb. You have taken a very interesting path in life. You started off in evolutionary biology. You quickly got bored by the test tubes and the fieldwork, in your words. You then moved into adventure travel. And when you were writing the I'll Try Anything column for Popular Mechanics, you tried everything. You piloted Zeppelins. You went scuba diving in the Arctic. You lived in an igloo. You spent the last 10 years of your life researching this mystery of the missing Malaysian airplane. You've also researched into Air France 447, German Wings 9525, the life of John McAfee. Before we talk about your work, I want to start with the simplest question. Why? Why do you do all of this? Why do you chase all these adventures? Why do you chase these mysteries? What are the driving forces? What is the motivation? And as you climb towards the summit, do you have the answer to the ultimate mystery, why you climb?
I don't know. I feel like that's a great question. I don't know if we have insight into our own motivations, frankly. I feel like we have beliefs about ourselves that are just guesswork, you know? Yeah. But I have a story that might explain something about it, which is that when I was about 11 years old, I was sitting in the front seat of a car. My mother drove into a tree. There was black ice on the road, and I was knocked out. And when I came to, I had been put on a snowbank, and I had been I had a head wound, and I'd been wrapped with bandages. And I slowly came to out of this state of kind of confusion and like a dream. It was almost like waking up from a dream. And in that state, I didn't know if I was going to live or die. I had no idea of like what, it was almost like back to first principles. Like imagine you're about to be born and not knowing what you're going to be born as, like maybe a baby bird that's like immediately going to like starve to death.
Yeah.
And I realized like, I have no idea if I'm going to be alive or dead. And I had this incredible sense of like how I'd wasted my life. Like my life had been like watching TV, worrying about dumb stuff. Not really. I felt like I'd been asleep, essentially.
How old were you?
I was like 11 years old.
Wasted your life at the age of 11.
And I think that changed my life because I felt like, oh my God, I'm like, I mean, talk about being born again, right? I felt like I inhabit the brain and body of a human being. And that is an incredible gift. And that hadn't even occurred to me before. And I think after that, I've always wanted to experience as many things as I can about life because I am going to die and I will like re-enter that phase of non-existence. Yeah. And so I think that might have something to do with it.
I can't imagine many 11-year-olds feeling like they've done something great with their life. Like, but when you're 11, you're supposed to watch TV and you're supposed to watch dumb stuff.
There's a thing that I think anybody who's ever felt like they're on the edge of maybe dying, of like this feeling of, oh my God, like I'm alive. Like you're alive in that moment and with an intensity you've never been alive before. And you wish that you had spent your entire life with that level of intensity.
Yeah. Wow. Do you think now the thrill of the adventure, the thrill of the mystery drives you more than the actual summit? Like, is the journey more important than the destination? Let's say hypothetically, we find the missing plane tomorrow.
Right.
Day 2, Are you going to sit back and relax? This weight is off your shoulders? Or do you think your mind's going to be buzzing? What's the next adventure? What's the next mystery I can sink my teeth into?
MH370 isn't a freestanding mystery. It's a mystery that's part of a larger mystery. We're constantly engaged in the process of trying to find meaning and incorporate new information into the meaning of what our world is. Yeah. And that process is broken as a society. We are in a state of confusion. We're unable to process complex events like MH370. And so for me, MH370 is not a thing in of itself. It's a test case for grappling with and dealing with complex situations. So MH370 being found or not being found doesn't actually change anything.
Right. So if you find the plane tomorrow, business as usual, day 2 for you.
Yeah, almost. I mean, it would be definitely a red letter day. But it doesn't alter anything about our fundamental. There's a much bigger problem that is kind of like my life's work at this point.
You mentioned something interesting about that incident where you were knocked out and you were on this limbo between life and death.
Right.
I want to expand that further.
Sure.
In your book, Fatal Descent, Andreas Lubitz and the Crash of Germanwings Flight 9525, you said the following words: each of the passengers has had the feeling before in an instant of worry during unexpected turbulence, of breathtaking dread, that sudden confrontation with the all too real possibility that life could end. Not somewhere in the distant future, but here and now, right now. On other occasions, those thoughts have been fleeting. Now they have come back, dwarfing those earlier shivers like the sun outshines a spark. In your book, Extreme Fear, The Science of Your Mind in Danger, you explore the psychology of fear, the nature of fear, how it rises in your mind, how it can take over completely.
Right.
Why do you think, as humans, we are so attracted to stories that make us afraid? Why is there such a market for these mysteries, these crime podcasts, crime stories, horror movies? Why do we have this morbid curiosity about every airplane crash? Do you think, like you mentioned in the book, is it because every one of us has at some point felt that visceral fear of being in a plane that's about to crash, that we can see ourselves in those situations?
Let me start answering that by saying, I feel like you've read both those books, which I'm like incredibly grateful, because I don't have any evidence that any other human being has ever read either of my books, let alone both. So thank you for that. I'm
finally
grateful
a break
to
a record in life.
Wow. But yeah, I mean, I do think that springs from this experience I had as a kid I do feel like there is this kind of, there's always the elephant in the room of every moment in our life, to the extent that we're aware of it or not, which is that we don't understand why we're here. We don't even know what it's like to be alive in this moment. And it's going to go away. And this is the thing that really kills me. I spent my whole life wondering is if there is some kind of mental state you can get to where you understand what this thing called life even is, enough that somehow dying will seem less unbearable. You know what I mean? I don't know if that answers your question at all.
It does answer my question, and I do have questions for you, but let's park that aside.
Okay.
I promise you we'll come back to it by the end of this episode. Okay, let's talk about an open project that you've been working on for the last 10 years of your life, the mystery of the missing Malaysian MH370. This is a complicated case, to say the least, and I know for sure you need multiple seasons and multiple episodes. I really dive down all the details in this.
So cool.
In this case. What I want to do now first is I just want to set the scene. I want to hopefully take an organized approach. Let's see if we stick to it.
Yeah.
I just want to lay out all the pieces first before the flight takes off. So can you paint the picture for me? It's March 8th, 2014. What are all the pieces that we need to know? What is MH370?
Yeah.
What route is it supposed to take? Who are the passengers? Who's in the crew? Who are the pilots? What cargo does it have? What is everything we need to know before the flight takes off?
Sure. So it's a very standard red-eye flight between Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, and Beijing, China. And the 239 passengers and crew. It's going to take off around midnight. It will take off towards the northwest on one of the major airstrips that's part of Kuala Lumpur International Airport. And it's good night, clear night, ideal conditions, not a lot of traffic. There's nothing to worry about. It seems like a very normal flight. The pilot is highly experienced, one of the most experienced pilots, captains in the Malaysian Airlines, roster. Yeah. The co-pilot is very inexperienced, by the standard of airline operations, but it's not no red flags there either. So it takes off a little bit after midnight. It's basically on schedule. Because there's no traffic, there's a whole departure procedure that is outlined for airline pilots to follow. But because there's no traffic, they get cleared to just forget that, just go straight to a waypoint that's at the edge of Malaysian airspace. And then once you're there, you'll be handed over to the next air traffic control zone at Ho Chi Minh. And then away you'll go. And up to that point, everything just went absolutely normal.
Can you provide a play-by-play of everything that happens from that point, from when the flight disappears all the way till this supposed point of last contact around 8 a.m.? What do we know? What has been reported from the satellite and military radar data? What is the official account?
I mean, that's a good question. This is a plane that disappeared 3 times. And that has never happened before. Planes have disappeared before, but no plane has ever disappeared 3 times. And what do I mean by that? So the plane reaches this final waypoint. It's called Igari, and it's at the edge of Malaysian controlled airspace. It's kind of a bookkeeping formality as to like different, they have meetings and they send letters back and forth and they have conventions and they agree, this controller will control this area, the next controller will control this area. Yeah. And so it was at the point where by routine, the pilot flying any flight would say, okay, thank you, good night, Kuala Lumpur. When he says good night, MH370, he's saying good night to the air traffic controller in Kuala Lumpur. And what he's supposed to do is then dial up, change the frequency of his radio, and call the next controller who's in Ho Chi Minh. But there's a 3-minute kind of lag time. I mean, this is human beings take a certain amount of time to do things. They have to give them a certain amount of, it's like a bathroom break kind of thing. Yeah. And so he has 3 minutes to switch over and say hello to Ho Chi Minh. So Ho Chi Minh is sitting there waiting. They've been notified this plane is coming. You'll be hearing from these guys. They'll come in. You'll see them on your radar. Yeah. How will they see them on their radar screens? Well, there's multiple different ways that planes communicate with air traffic control, right? And I don't know if you want me to get into what they are, sure. But they, to make a long story short, 6 seconds after the plane passes Igari, it disappears from these radar screens. The equipment that was sending out these signals, and there's a bunch of them, they all go dark, and they are turned off somehow. And so, what? And and so the time is going by, and Ho Chi Minh is like, I invited people to my party. Nobody's at my door yet. It's been 15 minutes. It's been half an hour. How long after the announced time of your party do you start to worry that it's been 2 hours and no one's at your party? Eventually, you start calling your friends. Did you know I was having a party? Didn't you? And so eventually they start checking in. They start saying, "Hey, Kuala Lumpur, your guy was supposed to come this way, right?" And Kuala Lumpur is like, yeah, they said goodbye to us. They're supposed to be there already. And so wait, they thought for various reasons, they thought they'd maybe gone to Cambodia. Calls are going back and forth. And as time goes by, there's more and more worry. And it's kind of like, if someone that you're expecting a loved one to come home and they're not there, they're late, and you go from being like, oh, they're just late, and you get more and more worried. It becomes worry. And so by the time that this plane is supposed to land in Beijing, no one has seen hide nor hair of it. They're freaking out. And they start to send out ships and planes to look for. Now, what mostly happens when it's starting to look like a crash, right? And so when planes crash, when something goes wrong, mostly what happens is they go down. And they're found within 5 miles of wherever the last contact was. You mentioned Air France 447 before. Yeah. Case similar in many respects. I doubt we'll have time to get into it, but that is something where they lost contact, and the wreckage ultimately was found within 5 miles of that last contact. So based on expectations of past incidents, probably this plane is in the South China Sea within 5 miles of that last point of contact. However, And this is looking like a very normal crash, very normal, tragic, sad, blessedly rare, but not unusual. But the next day, the story takes a major twist. And I mentioned this plane actually disappeared multiple times. Come to find, the Malaysian military looks at their radar data, and they see that actually this plane, when it went dark, it didn't crash. It turned 180, went back the way it had come, flew over the Malayan Peninsula and up the Malacca Strait, which is this body of water in between Thailand and Indonesia. Sort of empties out into the Andaman Sea, beyond which you get India. So it flies up the Malacca Straits, and then it vanishes again. That's the second vanishing. And they're like, oh, well, we better look there because, as I said, planes usually turn up to have crashed where you last saw them. Yeah. But so this had just left. It wasn't like it got turned off in the first case. In this case, it just left. It flew. It was flying actually quite fast. In fact, faster than planes usually travel. So whatever happened to this plane, it was now traveling faster than normal in this like weird, going off to the northwest. This is very, very strange. All of this part is very, very strange. And this is where we get a radical departure from expectations. We've never really seen anything like this before. And then it gets weirder. And this is the third vanishing, because some scientists at Inmarsat, which is a British satellite communications company, they've got a bunch of satellites around the world. One of them is parked over the Indian Ocean, 23,000 miles up, and it's stationary looking down at this part of the world. And it's taking in, it's basically receiving signals and transmitting, data from its customers on the ground, which are mostly ships and airplanes. And so they look at their database and they think, oh my God, we've actually got data from this thing for 6 more hours. So not only did this plane not crash, it went a long, long way. And then the signals blip out. They stop after 6 hours. And so that's the third vanishing. And so this is now fully weird. Like nothing like this has ever happened. And it really looks like somebody has taken this plane. And right away, right off the bat, who is going to take a plane? Well, you've got the captain and the co-pilot locked in the cockpit. They have the controls. Who else could do it? So right from the get-go, it looks like, I know you wanted to talk about the possibility that it was an accident, but 6 seconds after Gari, the plane goes dark, it does a 180, it accelerates, it's flying along actual airways, which are, defined by these navigational waypoints. So it looks like looks like deliberate action. It doesn't look like a ghost flight, which is what happens when like aircraft depressurizes and it just goes in a straight line until it runs out of fuel. It doesn't look like there's been an emergency, maybe the cockpit filled with smoke, or there was an emergency depressurization, because when that happens, you try to get down as quickly as possible. The first thing you do is put on your mask and then you go down. You don't go up and fast. You don't accelerate and fly over. But this plane flew over a major military base. So that's where it looked in the first couple of weeks after the disappearance.
I think you've done a fantastic job providing a concise summary, even though I saw you itching to start to go into the theories. Okay. But so far, It's been fantastic. Okay. Yeah, that's the data we know. Okay. We'll keep up that spirit and close the loop on all the other facts and findings and observations that we found after the plane disappeared. So multiple investigations were conducted by the Malaysian authorities. We searched the Indian Ocean as well. What other facts emerged after the plane has disappeared in the months after the disappearance? What do we find? Did we find any debris? What did the investigations show us? Okay, so the next important thing to know is that as they looked at these signals, they realized that whoever was on board this plane hadn't communicated using it. So this is the satellite communication system. Yeah. You use it. It's almost like your cell phone. You have your cell phone in your pocket. It is communicating with a cell phone tower. But if you're not making a call and no one's calling you, no one's texting you, it's just communicating the cell phone tower saying, hi, I'm here, but there's no information going back and forth. Yeah. That's the state that the SATCOM was in. It was lying dormant. And it's important to mention it was booted up specifically at a particular point. Right?
Okay. Yeah, this is a major, major, major clue.
Yeah.
But let me say one other thing first before I get to that, which is that because we didn't find out actually until later, the first thing we heard was that they had the data, and then that the data hadn't been carrying any messages, but that it had been pinging. They were called pings because it's basically like your cell phone just says to the cell phone tower, "Hey, I'm here. Yeah. If anyone's calling, just this is where I am." Mm-hmm. So every hour, if the thing wasn't used, the satellite would say, "Hey, are you still there?" Because remember, the clients are planes and ships, and they leave. So it wants to know, are you still in my area? Because if you're not, I want to stop worrying about you. And so these pings happened automatically. Two calls actually, because Malaysian Airlines was like, "Where's our plane?" And they tried calling the airplane twice. The calls went through into the onboard telephone system. It rang and nobody answered. That could have some significance that we could address later.
And now the pilot also tried to reach out and heard static and mumbling, I believe.
So after it had, this is a parenthetical, right? Somebody claimed later that he'd called the plane and the plane answered with mumbling. The thing is with a radio, it's not like calling a phone where like I'm calling your phone. And if I hear you mumbling, it's you. A radio, if someone's mumbling, you don't know who it is. So that whole story didn't make any sense, but it did get a lot of AAA. So they looked at these signals, and it turns out that there were two components of the metadata that were significant. This is where I have to really struggle to be concise, because this is where it gets really complicated, and the details of the complications really matter. Yeah. But let me suffice to say that from the metadata, it turned out that due to some unusual circumstances, you could actually determine where this plane went using this metadata. You shouldn't have expected to, but you could. And it showed that it went into a particular part of the Southern Ocean. Fast forwarding several years, they actually spend hundreds of millions of dollars to search this area. It's a technical marvel. I mean, I have hats off to them. 3 miles deep, 1,000 miles from the nearest land. They're using brand new cutting edge technology to scan in photographic detail the seabed. The plane is not there. Okay. That is the fourth vanishing. The plane keeps not being where it's supposed to be. I called I have a book about it. Did I call it The Plane That Wasn't There? Yeah, my first Kindle single I did about it was called The Plane That Wasn't There, because it kept not being where it was supposed to be. So it's bafflement after bafflement after bafflement. Now, you mentioned that, okay, so where did this data come from? Everybody assumed when this information was dropped that even though whoever turned off all the other electronic systems that made it go dark from air traffic control screens, they had forgotten or didn't know to turn off the SATCOM system, because most people don't know about it. I've talked to many, many 777 pilots since then, and they don't know that like there's a way to unplug the SATCOM system. However, somebody on board this plane did. They unplugged, they electrically somehow unplugged this box and plugged it back in. And only because of that did the signals resume. This to me is the crux, or one of several core clues in this mystery. Because if you're investigating a mystery where the perpetrator does something, you can reduce the list of possible suspects to those suspects who can do that thing. Yeah, that was done, right? If the person spoke Italian at some point, like then I'm innocent because I don't speak Italian, right? So whoever did this was sophisticated enough to do something that the average 777 captain doesn't know about. And in fact, in my podcast, I talked to a very experienced 777 captain who was actually part of the original flight test program of the 777 when it was first rolled out. He worked with Boeing engineers and talking about the different things you can do with the different planes' different systems. And he was like, I wouldn't know how to do this, or I would never do this. He would never do this. A captain, a normal 777 captain would not do this thing, which kind of cuts against the idea that it was the pilot, the captain, Zahari Ahmed Shah. So already I'm like, okay, this is much weirder. I'm thinking this is much weirder And you're hearing a lot of people talking about, well, because listen, everyone is talking about what happened to this plane. What could have been the explanation for why this plane disappeared? And what you're hearing a lot in the different forums, I was running a forum myself, Occam's razor. Simple explanations are best. People are saying like statistically, it's probably mechanical failure, right? And that approach is dead wrong. You know, you can't take a statistical approach to a unique event, you know? Statistically, nobody discovers relativity, you know, or solves the mystery of quantum mechanics. So like nobody does it. So the chances that Niels Bohr did it are very, very low. Yeah. Well, okay, human beings do unique things all the time. So I guess I've been trying to argue from very early on that this is a deeply strange case. It's complicated. Now I mentioned that the scientists were able to interpret this Inmarsat data to tell you where the plane went. The way that they did that is complicated. They published scientific papers about it. Most people haven't read those papers. If you publish a book or do a podcast without having understood what their methodology was, you're really making noise without anything behind it.
One thing I want to point out about that data, so there's two metrics that you use,
right?
BFO, burst frequency offset, and BTO, burst timing offset. Using that data, you're not able to pinpoint the exact location, but because of the way, I guess, waves travel, you can pinpoint a concentric circle on the map, and you can pinpoint it will be on a certain arc, right? Using the BFO data.
Right.
And one of the things you pointed out, we're still not going to go into the theory yet.
Okay.
Is that the BTO data and the BFO data had some contradictions. So they both didn't point in the exact location that you expect them to, right? It both did not point, like you didn't expect the plane to be in the southern part of the Indian Ocean by trying to use both the BF and the BTO data. I know you are itching to go into the details.
Well, I will just say that like that is just one example of a principle that exists throughout this case, which is that if you have two sets of data that could indicate some aspect of the case, they won't agree. You have consistent disagreement amongst the different data sets.
I agree. Okay, fantastic. I think you have pointed out some great details, observations, findings. I had listed down some observations and facts and findings as well that I want to quickly just rattle off.
You got it.
So that we can create hopefully a much wider picture.
Yeah.
And then we walk into the theories. But as I talk about these observations, I would love it if you can tell me where I'm going wrong. I'm going to use the word allegedly quite often.
Sure.
And if you feel you want to add them something, please let me know. Okay. So first observation. When it comes to the cargo, apparently there was a consignment of lithium-ion batteries in the cargo.
Yeah.
French investigators have also claimed there was a mysterious load of 89 kgs loaded into the flight at the last minute and not scanned. The validity of this claim is still under question.
Right.
Okay. Second observation. Few facts about the pilot. Authorities found that Captain Zahari had flown a similar path in his flight simulator at home in the previous month itself, very similar to the actual route that MH370 took. Even though the simulated flight was run into the Indian Ocean all the way till fuel exhaustion, just as speculated with the actual flight, this was labeled as not sinister in nature, as Zahari had flown thousands of other routes on that simulator. But one thing of note is that this is one of the few parts where Zahari had apparently manually progressed the flight in that section rather than let the simulator play it out itself. Some people have raised the question whether the simulation report is false or planted, especially because this was revealed nearly 2 years after the plane disappeared. Mm-hmm. One comment about the co-pilot was that this was his first flight without a supervisor. Every flight he's been on before, he's had a minder or a supervisor because he was training, right? And this was going to be his first full-fledged flight. But back to the pilot in command, Captain Zahari, reports on his character are mixed. Many colleagues and family members describe him as happy, likable, very well respected as a pilot. No red flags in his history at all, which is in strong contrast to when you look at a case like Andreas Lubitz, for example. Sure. In hindsight, you can see all the red flags, but even with this pilot, in hindsight, no one could see any red flags. He used to make YouTube videos in his free time. But there have been other reports of some people who have said that he was lonely, separated from his wife, and often confided in friends that he was depressed and used to pace around in an empty room. This is all alleged. Allegedly, his wife and kids moved out of their house the day before, not confirmed. And he was known to have extramarital affairs, not confirmed, with the cabin crew. Third observation. some people, including you, have raised the questions about the validity of the Inmarsat data. We just spoke about that, especially the contradictions between it.
I'm going to put an asterisk on that one, but we get
okay. Yeah. You have raised the question that not that the data is wrong, but whether it was planted and whether it means what we think it means.
I think it's important to draw a distinction between what my issues with the Inmarsat data and people who just question validity of all things.
Yeah. The only thing I want to point out is no one is taking that data as just like gospel. There are questions over the authenticity of it or what that means. Just want to make that observation. And we're definitely going to dive into your theory. So that's going to cover this. Okay. Fourth observation. Allegedly, after the flight went missing, some of the family members of the passengers tried to make phone calls to their relatives. A couple of them reported that the phones were still ringing for days after the flight went missing. This always gives me chills. In the Netflix documentary, they also claimed that a woman received a call from her father who was on the plane. But before she could pick it up, it got cut.
Right.
This is popularly known as the phantom cell phone theory. This one is obviously all alleged, but there's another fact about cell phone, which is that at a certain point when the plane crossed Penang, the co-pilot's phone connected with...
That did happen.
That's happen.
That's real.
With a network tower, which at least proves, I guess, that... I don't know what it proves.
There was some question as to whether the primary radar target seen pulling the 180 and flying up the Malacca Straits really was MH370 and not like a drone or some other plane. The Malaysian authorities themselves said that the reason it took them so long to announce that this data had been observed was that they weren't 100% sure it was MH370. That put that issue to rest.
Yeah. Fifth observation. This is something I find very interesting. There is a claim that the aircraft after the aircraft turns from south from Penang, it was put in a 22-minute holding pattern off the coast of Sumatra. I don't know how valid this claim is.
One of the aspects of the Inmarsat data is that you have an infinite number of ways to generate that data. So you have to use some statistical fancy techniques in order to winnow down the possibilities based on what's probable and what's not probable. There are things that could have happened that they match the data. So you could have put this plane into a holding pattern for 20 minutes and then it would have flown. And that would have changed where it wound up on the 7th arc. So someone has observed that this could have happened. Yeah. And if you want to think about the universe of all the possible endpoints that this plane could have had, that would be
why did this theory get a lot of wind? Because there have been a lot of reports about this holding pattern off the coast of Sumatra. I mean, you could take a holding pattern at any point in the arc always. Why this one in particular?
Well, so what tends to happen is that a person will come up with an idea and then they'll say that this idea is what happened. And that's a problem. We have to, ideally we can recognize the difference between a possibility and a theory or just an explanation, you know?
Yeah. Okay, noted.
Listen, I came here to your awesome studio to talk to you today, and I might have stopped at 59th Street Station to get a bagel. So then you go on the network news and say, Jeff got a bagel at 59th Street. Why do you think that? I mean, I could have. You have no reason to think that. It's among the many possibilities that could have happened. In fact, it didn't happen.
Gotcha. This is again alleged, residents of a remote island in Maldives called Kudahuadu in the Thal atoll reportedly saw a low-flying jumbo jet on the morning of March 9th.
Yeah.
A lot of questions about the validity of this claim. Seventh observation. I must mention that many people have raised questions about the authenticity of the data that's been presented, the investigations conducted by the Malaysian authorities. A lot of people have said it was incompetent. A lot of obfuscation of facts, whether the reports were edited, changed to make themselves look good or not. A lot of people have raised those questions. All the authorities in question have come in question. The official narrative, in quotes, is under a lot of scrutiny. Must point that out for sure. And one more observation, which is about the debris.
Yeah.
An American named Blaine Gibson was surprisingly lucky enough to find a lot of debris very quickly after so many people have been looking for it.
Right.
One of the most conclusive pieces of evidence that was found was this Flaperon that was found on the French island.
Not by him, but yeah.
Not by him.
Right.
On the French island of Reunion. I don't know, pardon my French. The interesting thing about that piece of debris is that you have said that it's definitely from that plane. It's been proven that it's from MH370.
I mean, there are serial numbers inside the Flaperon that are traceable to the factory in Spain where it was made. So let's never say 100%. Okay. But I would personally subjectively say like 99.99. I'm just calling it true.
The interesting part is that even if it's 99% from that plane, the barnacles that were found on that plane do not represent the barnacles you would expect to find if the plane had actually crashed in the southern Indian Ocean.
Yeah, I'd love to talk a lot about that, because that's actually where I think we can actually try to nail this thing.
We'll park that aside because we are going to talk about your project. Okay. So that's the place to talk. But I wanted to bring that out, that this did happen.
This is where I should say, and I should have said it way up top, I think we can solve this mystery. I'm here not just to, gab and flap my jaws. I want to solve this plane. I want to find this plane, and I want to talk. I want to try to convince people that we found it. And I think I'm trying to convince people that there's a methodology that is fruitful, and that there's questions we can ask and data that we can obtain that we can solve it.
Yeah, this is definitely an exciting project, so we will talk about it. Okay. But I wanted to bring up the debris because I'm sure in some of the theories this might come up.
Right.
Okay, I think we have covered all the observations. Is there anything else you want to add, or we can go into the theories?
So let's go back. Okay, cargo. There was mysterious cargo, mangosteens, lithium batteries, all these strange things. Here's the thing. As you're trying to solve a mystery, you collect all the evidence you can, and then you try to construct hypotheses from it. Not every fact is going to fit into your hypothesis. You're going to find evidence that is not probative one way or the other. One of the most popular YouTube videos about this mystery by a very talented YouTuber named Mentor Pilot, he spends a lot of his mystery talking about this call that was made between Zahari and air traffic control. And he wonders like why he made this call. It's strange, but it doesn't shed light on any possible theory. So why worry about it? Were there weird mangosteens on board the plane? Yeah, there was weird mangosteens on board the plane. We don't really know why, but it doesn't help us resolve what happened one way or the other. It's irrelevant, is I guess what I'm saying.
Okay.
People come to me and they say, hey, there were all these software engineers on board the plane. You should look into it. And I say, look into what? If you want me to explain how they took the plane, I don't see any way that they could have taken the plane. Did somebody want to steal them? Maybe. But that doesn't tell me how those other people who supposedly wanted to hijack these people did it. I think you get my point.
So that's the comment on the cargo. Any comments about the pilot or the co-pilot?
We don't. Yeah, you raised the point that there was no red flags about Zahari. That's true. Some people have. I think it's irresponsible. There was one famous American aviation journalist who said, "Oh, I had this anonymous source who says that he was having a marriage." This is the problem with anonymous sources: is that a lot of times what will happen is, I know this has happened. I've heard about this. You say to someone like, you're Zahari's used to work with Zahari. And I say to you, what do you think happened? And you say, I think Zahari took it. And my assumption is like, oh, a guy who used to work with him thinks he took it. Why do you think he took it? Because the news all says that he did. And so you shouldn't think that just because somebody says something, that means they have any informed basis for saying it. We have no confirmation of any kind of marital problems, debts, mental illness, anything that would make this guy do such a heinous and unthinkable act. There are cases of airplane pilots flying their plane into the ground to kill themselves and everyone aboard. They're incredibly rare, and they involve people who are on the edge of mental instability. There was one just actually quite recently where a guy tried to deploy the fire extinguishers aboard the engines of a plane. That's happened last year. And yeah, there's no signs of that, which is kind of I did an episode of my podcast about the dog that didn't bark in the night. And that is kind of like, how do you explain a guy you look at his YouTube videos, and I see a guy who is the sweetest, nicest, most emotionally stable, chill. This guy's had it made. He had this lifetime job. He was going to get a big fat pension. He had multiple houses, multiple cars. His family life sounded great.
Yeah, it's one of those cases where you see what you want to see I saw the same thing, but there are people who see his videos about plugging a window and they're like, oh, why is he in the newspapers? The headlines are sending a message.
Exactly.
So I know.
there was one piece of evidence, and I was the one who first publicized it. It was about the fact that he had this flight simulator. And there was a month before he took the plane, supposedly he took the plane, he flew a flight that, as you said accurately, wound up in the Southern Ocean with zero fuel. And there's a lot of questions. Why don't we have more of this data? Can we have more information, please, Malaysian authorities, about the provenance of this data and so on? However, I would say that, again, it's all in the eye of the beholder. Is it proof positive? Now, this is not a flight that went to Agari and did a 180 and went up the Malacca Straits. This is a flight that just went up the Malacca Straits without that sort of whole Agari part, which is really a baffling and hard to explain part. Yeah. And after he did that flight, it's worth noting, he did other flights. He did a kind of recreational flight in a DC-3. He did another flight, I think, in a 737. And to me, I'm like, if you're planning to kill yourself and you're using this flight simulator to kind of practice killing yourself, do you then, just for sheer amusement, do something else? Yeah. Something that people who are depressed enough to be suicidal experience is a condition called anhedonia. You don't feel pleasure. So you're actually in a state of agony. You mentioned Andreas Lubitz, who flew his plane into the Alps and killed everyone on board. He was at the edge of his rope, at the end of his rope, because he thought that his career was over. He thought he wasn't going to be a pilot anymore. He was going to lose his identity. He wasn't playing Mario Kart. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. So I do feel that although I do think this is the only damning evidence against Zaharie, and I think it definitely deserves consideration, careful consideration. I would like to know more about it. I don't think it's the smoking gun that some people think it is.
We don't even have data whether he had conducted similar flights that ended in fuel exhaustion somewhere else in the world as well. Because when I play a game, I try to break the game as well. If I'm playing a racing game, I try to crash into things. You try to do things that you can't do in real life, right? So,
well, the way he said it too is he put it to 3,000 feet and he put the fuel to zero, and that's pretty much exactly what happened to Sullenberger. The Miracle on the Hudson. So I wondered and that was over water too. It was right over here. Yeah. You probably see it from your window. But then there was another one that he set it for higher up. I think it was at 30,000 feet, and he set the fuel to zero. And that looked a lot like another really famous case called the Gimli glider, where the pilots ran out of fuel and had to find a way to land, and they did. It was actually amazing. So maybe he was trying to do something else. Also, the data is incomplete. We don't really know. Hard to form. This is what we have to do. When you're trying to solve a mystery, get all of the data. This is a main part of my message. Get all of the data and understand it as deeply as you can. So both broad and deep understanding of all the available data. And you have to then you have to get all the hypotheses that match that data to a more or less degree. And I'll tell you, nothing fits all the data perfectly. But something happened to this plane. So there is an explanation that fits all of the data. Now, sometimes data can be wrong. Like the case of this flight simulator, we don't know every aspect of it. There might be some part of it that is more or less damning about him.
Awesome. And then the final few observations, and I had said all of this is alleged. So
yeah,
the people who saw in Maldives, who saw low-flying jumbo jets, some people said it could have been a Saudi jet as well.
Again, it's when you take all of the evidence, one of the things that's very standard in air crash investigation is that eyewitness accounts, which intuitively we give a lot of credence to. Well, many people have been sent to death row on eyewitness testimony. It's actually very, very unreliable.
I can see that. Also, phantom cell phone theory.
I mean, that's one of my main beefs about I thought the Netflix documentary in general was well done. I spent a lot of time talking to them, and I think they really understood what I was saying. The inclusion of that call, I think, was a little bit irresponsible because they kind of leave it hanging. And if it was true, it would be a huge deal. And I just don't think it really happened. And I mean, the idea that somebody would say, oh, hey, my grandfather who's missing on this flight is calling me. What should I do? Let me go talk to a stranger and ask them for their advice about whether I should accept this call from my grandfather who's missing on the plane.
I don't know. People react differently in moments of panic. I had an English lesson called The Monkey's Paw about this.
Oh, yeah.
Where someone came back from the dead and started knocking on the door and people started panicking. I don't know what the first reaction would be.
Well, at this point, no, but this was the day of. I mean, it wasn't like they hadn't been pronounced dead at this point. Nobody knew where they were. So, but let me also say that what we tend to forget now, because we have much more clarity now on what happened. At the time, it was a swirl of rumors. Many, many reports in the reliable media turned out not to be true.
And the final observation was about the debris, but I'm sure we'll talk about it in detail.
Yes.
Okay, we have covered all the observations. Time to move to the theories.
Whew.
Okay, let's go.
Okay.
You have often said that planes go up, planes go down.
Yes, my teenage boys are like, you're famous on TikTok. It's a meme on TikTok. Yeah.
What planes don't do is just vanish off the face of the earth. MH370 is a plane that went up, but it never went down. It vanished off the face of the earth.
3 times, in fact.
Yeah.
4 times.
There are many theories that are out there about what happened to the plane, and there's no way we can do justice to most of them. So what I want to do is I want to quickly list down 2 theories.
Can I push back against that? Because this is something I have to push back a lot. One of the greatest misunderstandings about MH370 that I hear from editors and TV producers a lot is that there's many, many theories about it. There actually aren't. There's a difference between an idea and a theory. An idea is just a notion that pops into your head and doesn't have any relation to evidence, right? And so, but yes, there's a lot of theories that people have popped off because it occurred to them. But that's not the same thing as an actual hypothesis that's rooted in evidence.
There are many hypotheses.
No, there's not. There's 2. There's only 2 hypotheses. That legitimately, there's a lot of crazy notions. There's a lot of notions about MH370. But I'm not asking you to redo your intro, but I think that this is worth actually having a bit of discomfort about. Yeah. Okay? Because this is how we rethink things. We need to rethink it. Look, one thing everyone agrees on, we don't have the plane. That's our baseline, right? We all agree that we don't know where the plane is. And so we're trying to get there. And we can also argue about procedure. How do you find clarity amidst confusion? And so what I push back on, there's this kind of democratic idea that like one man's opinion is as good as another. In fact, in the Netflix documentary, in the context of someone, mentioning my theory, a guy, I think rather smugly from the Australian Transportation Bureau says, opinions are like assholes. Everyone's got one. The theory that I outlined is not an opinion. It's not just something I pulled out of my butt. Okay. And in that regard, it's very different from someone who says that the Americans shot it down, because that is an idea for which there is no evidence. It's been well articulated. Again, my beef with Netflix, my major beef with Netflix, is that it gave a lot of credence to a very silly idea. Put forward.
Speak of timing.
Planes and trains and automobiles. So anyway, I do think it's important to say that it's really important that we don't treat all of these things with equal respect.
I'm still going to list out one crazy notion.
Okay.
I just want to run the sequence of events with you. I agree it's not close to being a theory, but I still want to just bring it out there because I'm sure a lot of people are thinking.
So you want to say why it's ridiculous, if it's ridiculous?
Yeah, just break it. Let's point out the holes in this hypothesis or the crazy notion, whatever label we're going to give it. So this is something I'm calling the accident hypothesis, the accident crazy notion. This is the sequence of events. At 12:42 a.m., the flight takes off from Kuala Lumpur. At 1:21 a.m., just after the flight crossed the Malaysian airspace, an accident occurs on the plane. Either the lithium-ion cargo caught fire, something else exploded on the plane, there's a hypoxia event, a bird collision, maybe something goes wrong with the aircraft, we don't know. Something happens that causes electrical failure, switches off the flight's communication system, depressurizes the cabin, we don't know. Immediately incapacitating all the passengers. The pilots realize what has happened and immediately swerve back to go back to Malaysia, going at a much higher speed. Because they're not able to communicate with air traffic control, there's a lot of confusion around what to do. So they fly over mainland. They try to think of what
because they couldn't contact Malaysian air traffic control? Oh, because the
run
radio
with my
died
crazy notion. Just run with my crazy notion for now. I know there are many holes. Okay. So something's happened.
They turn back, they climb.
Yeah. They have panicked, right? They don't know what to do. And they also keep into account that in Malaysia, there's a strong stigma around, like, I guess, there's a stigma around how society might shun you, how you might be viewed in case you're flying an aircraft that's had an accident on it with tragic consequences. Okay, they go back.
I don't think anybody's like, oh boy, I'm crashing this airplane. People are going to think badly of me.
Nobody knows how people think. Okay. Pilots are not able to think clearly. They panic. I've never been in that situation. I don't know how I would react. There are passengers who've been severely incapacitated. And at some point, let's say the pilots decide that this plane is probably going to be crashing in the Southern Indian Ocean. Either they commit suicide or they control it all the way till the very end. Okay. I'll concede. This is the weakest. One of the weakest. It's not even a theory. It's a crazy notion.
Kind of a family of theories, really. It's like these are all of the theories in which like it's not their fault. Nobody's at fault. It's just like something happened and then they reacted and then some other things happened. And like, yeah, maybe it was just bad luck.
The optimist in me is trying to think of this theory, this crazy notion.
I think people are attracted to it.
I want people to be nice at the core. I'll concede that there are a lot of holes in this theory. The first one, you brought it up immediately, which is like, why did all the satellite calls go unanswered? Multiple attempts were made to reach out to the aircraft. None of them were answered. Maybe they were trying to respond. Maybe they couldn't reach it. I don't know. Okay. If you are in trouble, if there's an accident, why not try to go back and like try to land, like you mentioned earlier?
Right.
Why not try to circle around mainland, try to signal for help? There are so many ways to send a signal that you need help, even if you cannot communicate. None of that happened. Okay. Another big hole is that if you believe the data around the debris or the Inmarsat data, there's a reason to believe someone was controlling the aircraft all the way till the very end.
Yep.
Not that the pilots committed suicide. So many holes in this crazy notion. Want to bring the expert in. What works for this crazy notion? What doesn't work? How plausible is it?
I mean, suffice to say that nobody who spent any time like really delving into it, there's nobody actually out there promoting this idea. I don't think, seriously. The two, I mean, there's many reasons why you wouldn't take it seriously, but one is that you wouldn't see the electrical system being turned off to the SATCOM and then turned back on again. There's no real, it's very, I mean, the people who make that kind of claim are like, they don't really know how electrical systems work on airplanes and they just sort of imagine that like kind of anything can happen. Nobody has gone to the effort of actually trying to explain how this, what we observe could occur. And I think a bigger one, and this applies also broadly, is that if it did wind up being what we call a ghost flight into the Southern Indian Ocean, like you see with cases of hypoxia, where Payne Stewart is the famous case of a private jet that accidentally depressurized at altitude. Everybody on board died. And the plane just flew in autopilot, super creepy, like a fighter pilot flew alongside and could see, it was all gross. So that can happen, but what you would expect to see is it flies in a straight line and then it kind of glides, like it winds up spiraling down. And then the wreckage would have been found on the seabed and it wasn't. So that in itself is like a really powerful reason to think that this isn't a productive.
I agree. This was a weak, crazy notion.
But listen, we never want to say never.
But I want to create a benchmark. So how plausible is this rate out of 10?
0.1.
0.1, a strong start. Let's go. Let's move to the second. I'm not going to call this a crazy notion. I'm actually going to call this a theory, which is the pilot theory.
Yeah, this is the default theory.
This is the default, most commonly accepted one. Many people closed the case in their minds when this theory took shape, but there are a few things that just don't add up. Right. So I want to again run the sequence of events. 12:42 a.m., the flight takes off from Kuala Lumpur. Around 1:15, 1:20 a.m., the pilot in command, Captain Zahari, asks his first officer to go check something in the cabin, maybe. When the first officer leaves, Zahari locks the cockpit. At 1:20 a.m., Zahari responds to air traffic control saying, "Good night, Malaysian 370." But he doesn't read back the frequency as his protocol, effectively sealing his last message to the world. After MH370 disappeared from secondary radar, it turned sharply to the southwest, flew back across the Malay Peninsula and banked around the island of Penang. One of the big questions has always been, why take this route in particular.
Right.
With this theory, you have a clear motive.
He's from Penang. He wants to look at the island.
Yeah.
Right.
Which makes sense to me.
Sure.
Wave your hometown one final goodbye. It's possible that's what the pilot wanted to do. Okay. Some people have also raised the question whether the plane was skirted around the boundaries of many different flight information regions. You need a skillful pilot for this. The pilot theory supports that as well. I'm still sticking for the pilot was maybe because we spoke about his history of not having any red flags. Maybe there was a mistake with tragic consequences and the only way to like save face was to make sure this flight disappears. Like he didn't have bad intentions when he started off, but something went wrong on the plane.
Right.
And then this is a skilled pilot just trying to make sure that nothing's
He hated the in-flight meal so much.
It's possible. 10 years ago, the in-flight meals were pretty bad. Malaysian Airlines.
We shouldn't laugh about this stuff, but
Malaysian Airlines has been, I mean, you've seen with the reports later how they edited some of the facts that they want to always make themselves look good. They want to make it look like the flight had a problem. It's possible. Yeah. You never know. And then how society treats someone who's made a mistake like this. You know for a fact his life and career would have been over if there was a mistake. So you don't know what's running through his mind. Okay. That is my theory. So then he's flying it back. He's in control, takes a plane to the southern Indian Ocean, crashes it, makes it hard to find. End of theory. Now, I also want to point out the big holes in this in the interest of fairness.
Sure.
And then we'll bring in the expert again.
Okay, sure.
So big hole, if this is a murder-suicide, this is an unnecessarily complicated one because no motives were established, no messages were left behind, no notes. If someone wants to commit a suicide, this is a very painful way to do it. Why fly 6 hours into the ocean? There are much more straightforward ways of doing this, right? Maybe he wanted to see one final sunrise over the Indian Ocean, over this ocean that he's flown over so many times. I can buy that motive.
Sure.
A lot of his friends have said that he would have never done something like this. Very well liked, very respected. No red flags in the past. We've spoken about this. Still backs my unintentional mistake with tragic consequences. So either the pilot had nefarious motives or panicked at the last minute, something went wrong.
Right.
Okay. And one final comment to make about this is the satellite data was booted up again manually. It's possible the pilot did this to fake it, but no pilot is trained to do this. We just spoke about it. So that seems unlikely. Also, the location of that, I think it's not in the cockpit. Like you cannot access that receiver in the cockpit itself.
Yeah, it gets complicated.
It is complicated. And then the final thing I want to point out is if the whole idea for the pilot was to make this a mystery, he had to know the prime suspect would be the pilot itself. So why go through all this effort when you know that 80% of the people are going to believe
it's a really great point.
It is going to be the pilot. Okay. That's the theory. Those are some of the holes I could pick. Let's bring the expert. This is one of the most popular theories. What works, what doesn't work?
I think it's important to understand, actually. I think this might even be a key aspect of this case. This is a mystery that looks at first glance like a clear-cut case of the pilot taking it. That's what it looks like. And, I like to I often talk about magicians and how a stage magician creates an illusion. And a part of creating illusion is having two narratives. There's the thing that's really happening and the thing that you think is happening. When I cut my assistant in half, the sort of A narrative is that I'm sawing her in half. Okay. And then that creates this amazing thing about like, oh my God, he's committing murder on stage. And then lo and behold, she's in two parts, but she's alive. And then she gets back together. It's like, I'm so baffled. But it's important to establish like, what are we supposed to think? And in the case of MH370, I think what it looks like is a pilot suicide. But with a magic trick, if you look more carefully, there's things that don't quite add up. And in the case of MH370, I think there are things that don't really add up. They don't match what that A narrative is supposed to be. And you've mentioned a bunch of them. One of them is that, well, actually, you know what? Let me stop. Let me pause my own discussion here and say, I want to talk about what the person who took this plane is like. I'm going to I'm going to set aside the possibility that it was an accident. I'm going to say, let's stipulate that somebody took this plane. Okay. And I in my podcast, I quote the Tony Blair, the former Australian Prime Minister, as he revealed that he talked to the Malaysians and they told him, we think the pilot took it. because there's only one place to control an airplane, and that is the cockpit. And the Zaharie was in charge of the cockpit. Okay, but what was the person who took this plane like? Okay, we know that just from the evidence that we have. We don't, even before we know the identity, we know what they're like. And what are they like? They're sophisticated. Like, this is someone who flew an airplane. They at least know how to fly a 777. They also knew where waypoints are, because I'm gonna sort of take as stipulated that the fact that it was 6 seconds after Agari that all this went down indicates that this was done because of Agari. They waited until the plane was in between air traffic control zones when nobody was looking at them, and they vanished at a time where nobody would notice that they had vanished. Okay, so they were clever, they were sophisticated, they were aggressive, I would say, because this plane took a hard 180. And I think this point is somewhat in contention, but some people have said the autopilot can't do that turn. You have to do it manually. We do know that the plane accelerated and probably climbed, which is not something that you would do in an accident. But this plane flew like a bat out of hell up the Malacca Straits. So they seem motivated, frankly. So, and I think we could add a third component, which is ruthless. They undertook a deliberate course of action that seemed well planned out and resulted in the death, let's say, of hundreds of passengers and crew. So sophisticated, aggressive, and ruthless is what we have. And that, I think, is pretty solid. Again, Zaharie ticks off some of these boxes. He did know a lot about planes. But if we look at how this is something I've really been grappling with, is how to explain why what happened to the satellite data unit, this box that got turned off and on again, I think is dispositive in a way that people don't appreciate, which is that we started to touch on how do you turn it off? And there's basically 3 ways. One is to leave the cockpit, go into the first class compartment, pull back a rug, open an unlocked hatch, go into the electronics bay, and there are circuit breakers down there that if you know what you're doing, you can pull them. And then you could put them back and then the thing would restart again. That requires leaving the cockpit. There's only 1 minute between Zaharie, we can identify him from his voice, saying good night, Malaysia, good night, MH370, and the plane going dark. Is that enough time? Pilots I've talked to don't think so. So that leaves doing it in the cockpit. And basically, if you reach up to the overhead panel on your left, above the captain, there are these switches that you can turn off. You can basically isolate, meaning turn off the entire half of the electrical system of the plane. And that actually won't have that much effect you'll be able to use a lot of other systems, but it will have the effect of turning off the SDU. And so there's been a lot of speculation that that must be what Zaharie did, because because the SDU was isolated. And this is where I think I really try to grapple with how do I talk to the public about this, and is that this is not something, I've talked to a lot of 777 pilots, this is not something that they would know how to do, that they would want to do, in that turning off circuit breakers is something that pilots are pretty much trained not to do, you know? And it's also something there's no motivation to do. Like, why would you not just turn off the systems that use the SATCOM, but actually go through the extra trouble and risk of actually electrically isolating this piece of equipment? Now, some people say, well, he didn't care about risk because he was committing suicide. I'm like, well, it's like, if my plan is to commit suicide by jumping into the Hudson, it's a risk for me to jump out the window here to do it because I'm going to break my legs and I'm not going to get to carry out my plan, right? So there are risks that even a suicidal person will not want to take. So there's just many, many reasons why I feel that the reboot of this SDU is an indication that Zaharie did not do it, that it is not something he would be capable of or motivated to do. And I really wanted to spend a little bit of time. I actually want to do a whole episode about this. What would be the motive for turning off the SDU? And some people have said, well, he wanted to be extra sure that this was the perfect crime and that he would nobody would think it was him. Okay, so many problems with that. First of all, as you said, he's the person who would be suspect first of all. Secondly, he flew over a Malaysian Air Force base that had radar. So it wasn't being very subtle and sneaky. And then you also get this weird kind of conflicting notional motives. Like he wanted to commit the perfect crime, but he also wanted to like be recognized as a genius for doing it. You know, those are very contradictory motives. Yeah. Like what was he trying to do? What was his goal? Yes, to commit suicide, sure. But he didn't just commit suicide. Every other case that we know of where people do this, they either just push the nose down. In the case of German wings, he programmed a new altitude into it that would mean he was going to hit the earth. But basically, you do it. The idea of a protracted suicide is another level of weirdness to a deeply weird case. And so the gist of what I'm proposing is that this is a case where, okay, wait, let me stop. I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to spill the beans just yet. But let me say this. It was June of 2014 where we learned that the SDU hadn't just been left on, as we initially assumed, but that it had been turned off and back on again. And this was kind of mind-blowing. And I started asking around, well, how, and what we also found out is how the scientists used that data to figure out where the plane went. And it's very, very interesting, but I will suffice to say that after having rolled up my sleeves and figured out that yes, what they were saying was true, I started asking around is how is this data generated? And it turned out that MH370 had a string of unusual aspects to it. If it didn't have any one of these aspects, this whole scenario that I'm about to lay out would be impossible. But this had what I would call in total a unique cybersecurity vulnerability, which you know about because you've read my books. But the idea is that this was a kind of a black swan, unusual plane in that if you knew what you were doing, if you were incredibly sophisticated, and remember, we know that who carried this out is sophisticated. If you were sophisticated, ruthless, and aggressive, you could get into that electronics bay and do something to the data to make it look like the plane went south when it really went north. And because of this, I was skeptical that the plane had gone south at all. It seemed to me a very unlikely coincidence that a plane that happened to have a very rare vulnerability was the plane that had created these signals in a way no plane in human history had ever created these signals that Inmarsat recorded. And that was never really remarked upon. When people talk about this Inmarsat data, what it means, and like how the pilot could have committed suicide, this plane wound up in an electrical configuration that no plane has ever been in before or since.
I want to hold on to your thoughts about this because I want to close the loop on the pilot and then we can dive into the spoof theory completely.
Yep, sure.
Let's close the pilot loop for now.
Right.
You mentioned something interesting about this contradiction where the pilot wants to say, if the pilot theory is true, the pilot wants to signal that he's a genius, but also create this mystery. It's a perfect contradiction.
Right.
This theory is probably the one with the deepest exploration of human psychology and motives.
Right.
And you have written a book about fear. You have studied psychology. So I want to ask you your thoughts on this. In July of 2019, The Atlantic published a cover story titled Good Night Malaysian 370.
Yes.
In which they explore the pilot theory with the following words, which brings us back to the demise of MH370. It is easy to imagine Zahari towards the end, strapped into an ultra-comfortable seat in the cockpit, inhabiting his cocoon in the glow of familiar instruments, knowing that there could be no return from what he had done, and feeling no need to hurry. He would long since have repressurized the airplane and warmed it to the right degree. There was the hum of the living machine, the beautiful abstractions on the flat screen displays, the carefully considered backlighting of all the switches and circuit breakers. There was the gentle whoosh of the air rushing by. The cockpit is the deepest, most protective, most private sort of home. Around 7 a.m., the sun rose over the eastern horizon to the airplane's left. A few minutes later, it lit the ocean far below. There are so many documentaries, movies, and books about psychopaths, serial killers, murderers. Many of them come across as likable, charming, very meticulous, normal people in society. Frighteningly, a lot of them also treat their murders like art or like game or like sport. You have so many movies. Movie 7 was about a similar murderer. The Zodiac Killer in real life is a good example. Buffalo Bill from Silence of the Lambs, based on many real life serial killers who treated their murders like game or sport. Ted Bundy's another example, treated like an art form in a very sick way.
Right.
Is it possible that this was a psychopathic, deranged, depressed pilot's magnum opus? That creating the world's most complicated, unsolvable airplane mystery is his way. He only knew how to fly planes. This is the only thing he knew he was good at. Creating this type of a mystery was his way of leaving a legacy behind.
I sort of think that that's true, actually, but not by the pilot. I think somebody else had that mindset, actually. However, I will caveat that by saying I don't see a lot of value of imagining mental states of people. Yeah. Human beings are unknowable. And I think time and time again, where we find something baffling, it turns out that what occurred was just idiosyncratic, right? Like Air France 447 is a great mystery. Like we spent 2 years wondering how did this plane come to grief? It seemed like a great mystery. Yeah. And when we found out what happened, it turned out to be something that I don't think anybody could have guessed. Basically, somebody thought this and somebody else thought that. And because neither understood what the other person was thinking, that's why the plane crashed. And so you can there's all sorts of mental states that you can imagine, but ultimately I don't think they have any, I think you should only really do that once you already know what happened. If you know that somebody, went to a clown festival and then he like put on like clown makeup and maybe he thought like this was all done as an homage to his favorite famous clown or something. Yeah. It was something weird, you would never guess that beforehand. That's what I'm trying to say. Does that make any sense?
Makes a lot of sense to me. Okay, let's close the loop on the pilot theory. How plausible is it out of 10? We had 0.1 for the accident theories. That's the benchmark.
I mean, this is very much me, but I think it's like a 1.
A 1?
Yeah. I think that there's so much other context that doesn't fit into. And here's the important thing about the pilot theory. It's comforting in a sense. If Zahari took the plane, it was one of those random things. It was like getting hit by lightning. There's nothing you can really, like I could get hit by a meteor. And if I do, and I get killed by a meteor, you're not going to change your life. You're not going to live your life trying to avoid being hit by a meteor because in your heart of hearts, you're never going to get it.
It answers all the questions, doesn't leave any other open questions. Right? That's why it's comforting.
You don't have to do anything. It's like you can say case closed and be like, I'm done. Yeah. Bye. I'm not going to think about this anymore. And that's really what I'm fighting about. Because once people have a theory, the hardest people to convince are some people who are convinced they already know. And so I'm basically, my job is to try to like pry their fingers off that certainty.
Let's do it. Let's
try.
Pry people out of these theories. Right. We went from 0.1 to 1. Right. We can only go up from here.
Yeah, I think so. Let's talk
about the main theory. Let's talk about the spoof theory. I don't need to read out the sequence of events. I have the person whose theory it is. Can you walk me through what happens in the sequence of events? 12:42 a.m., the flight takes off. What happens in the spoof theory?
Well, if I may indulge myself by saying that I want to talk about context.
Let's do it.
Which is that you have a country that has been a great power, that is one of the world's great civilizations, and has been brought to its knees through chicanery and treachery, and is, prostrate. One is the gland and one is the terrible thing. One is lying down and one is anyway.
I know what you mean.
Anyway, prostate. Your prostate is, anyway, you're in a terrible state, and you are and you come to power in the year 2000, and you want to reclaim your greatness. Your greatness is a vision of imperial Russia, which nobody screws with, and you are powerful and you are respected, and you have a league of sort of vassal nations around you. And you've got all this oil money coming in, and you are using it to rebuild your military, build electronic warfare, build your espionage, build your spy capacity. There's an agency called the GRU that's particularly, and so what you're doing is you're kind of trying to build up all. And now here's the problem: you are in a fundamentally asymmetric situation where you can't match one for one the tanks and airplanes and technology of the West. And you fundamentally hate their way of life and their freedom. It's about liberal democracy. You have a model that is much more about organized crime and spies and like top-down power. This is a great Russian tradition of top-down, maybe feudalistic at best, but you're trying to spread a vision of how the world works. And so you essentially are vexed that these color revolutions are happening in what's called the near abroad. And basically you feel that the West is engaging in what you call hybrid warfare. They're trying to undermine you by misinformation, and various kinds of unfair trade practices and so forth. And so they are doing things like trying to get Georgia and Ukraine and Belarus and countries like this to join the EU, to join NATO, to basically leave your team and go to their team. And you find that this is a red flag and you find it's awful. So you're trying to think of all the different ways that you can mess with them, but you can't do it. It has to be what they call gray zone. Like you can't actually shoot them, like, which is what you want to do, but you can't because they're stronger than you. So you have to come up with all these different ways to subvert, infiltrate, assassinate. And basically you take to your team, you take the smartest people, not the cannon fodder masses, but the smart ones. And you say, how can we screw with the West? What can we do? And just give me any ideas that you want. And some of them are like, you know what? Remember this thing, Air France 447 that happened? A plane it left an area of air traffic control, and it had several hours before it went to the next area of air traffic control. And nobody paid attention to it. So you had this time. So what we can do is essentially, we can make a plane vanish like a magician's trick. We can make it vanish into thin air. And as this is, why would we do that? Because while this is happening, whatever else we're doing elsewhere in the world, their attention will be elsewhere. It's like it's like setting off a smoke bomb over here while you're raiding the Capitol or something, right? So they came up with this plan that they could make a plane. It's an elaborate magic trick that we can carry out, but we need to have a plane that meets all these criteria. It has to be a 777. It has to have an SDU that's made by Thales, not Rockwell. It has to have an Inmarsat subscription that it's at the lowest level. It has to, this flight needs to start around the equator, ideally in the middle of the night. And it has to be such that we're going to steal it. We're going to hijack it. It's going to come up to one of our allies. And the mirror image of this route has to be over open ocean where nobody can see it. Like there's no radars, no ships, and nothing. So they found a plane that matched all these criteria. And they had to build from scratch the electronic equipment, which was easy for them to do because they have one of the world's most advanced electronic warfare and cyber security industries. Mm-hmm. They got these guys on board the plane. They waited until the plane was on its cruise phase. And one of the guys, this is like my little scenario I paint. I'm not saying I have any reason to think this is true, but this is my little story. Two guys from the back come up and they go, "We want to sit in first class." And all the stewardesses are like, "Yeah, but you can't. You don't have a ticket." No, we want to. We deserve to. No. So now all the stewards and stewardesses are like fighting with these two people. Another guy who's sitting in first class goes up towards the toilet, sees nobody's around, flips up the carpet, opens the hatch, goes down inside, plugs his electronic box into the Air 629 bus. Now he has control of the communications and of the flight controls. He waits until the plane hits a gari. He hits go on the button, and he now has control of the plane. He just depressurizes the cockpit. He's actually an expert diver, so he like puts on a mask and he like is able to breathe air. And he seizes control of the plane, does a hard 180, flies up the Malacca Straits, turns and by this point everyone's incapacitated, including the pilots. And he basically takes over the plane. And here's an interesting thing that a lot of people don't know. The plane disappeared from radar. And then it turned to the northwest. It didn't turn towards the south. We can see it on radar turning on a heading toward Central Asia. If it continues flying on that heading, which in a way that matches the Inmarsat data that hasn't been spoofed, it then lands in Kazakhstan. It winds up in an area near where Russia has actually several secret bases. So that's basically the spoof theory. And when I was starting to think about this back in June of 2014, there was a couple of predictions that this made, and a good theory has a prediction, right? Mm-hmm. One of the ideas was that it's not going to be found on the seabed, and so when there were pingers starting to go off, I went on CNN and I said those pingers aren't from MH370. Now, there was another reason to suspect that they weren't. The frequency was a little bit off.
Yeah.
But the bigger implication of the spoof theory is that the plane would not be found on the southern seabed. Now, at this point, my confidence in this theory was not very good. I just said, like, this is a possibility you should be aware of. I said, and I went on TV in March of 2015, and I said, look, if you don't, there is another way to explain this Inmarsat data that you got. And so if the plane doesn't, if you look on the seabed and it's not there, this might be why. So come back. And I sort of thought that it was scary, frankly, because as the seabed was being searched at any day, the plane could have been found. In fact, everybody else except me fully expected. My very first episode of season 1 of, we called it Deep Dive MH370. I start with a quote from, I interviewed this guy who was part of the search team, and he talked about how they fully expected every day that they were going to find the plane. That would have put my theory to bed permanently. But it never happened. They searched and they searched and they searched. They searched a huge area of the seabed. The plane is not there. And so I say that itself is evidence away from the pilot taking the plane. And it's evidence that again, something that the world is a different place from where it was in 2014. We now know that, yes, Russia did, starting around that time, did launch an aggressive hybrid gray zone war against the West to try to undermine Western democracies. They interfered with Brexit. They interfered with the US election. They helped Donald Trump get elected. Donald Trump then, did all kinds of things to help Russia. And assassinations, the gamut. They're now openly engaged in a aggressive campaign of sabotage in Europe. They've, of course, fully invaded Ukraine, and they've had casualties of now 600,000 plus. I mean, it's a massive, massive disaster. And I'll tell you, when I first started to formulate this idea, I felt a great sense of urgency, because even though it was scary to come out with an idea that everyone else thought was ridiculous, frankly, there were stakes. The idea that somebody had carried out an attack against the West that was so clever, so sophisticated, that not only could we not figure it out, but even if someone tried to lay it out for the authorities were just categorically unable to grasp what I was talking about. We were completely outclassed and outmaneuvered by an enemy that was so ruthless and so much smarter than us. And I was like, I have to somehow warn people, because my great fear, as I said, I predicted that the implication of this theory is that the plane wasn't on the southern seabed. Another implication of this theory is that Russia was about to launch a very destructive gray zone war against the West. That happened. I failed. My sense of urgency to prevent something bad happened turned out to be exactly my worst fears. And here it is. It's 11 years later. All these bad things have already happened. The sense of urgency is somewhat dispelled, actually, because all the bad things I worried about actually happened. And this is the world that we live in now. But I still want to say, at least in retrospect, world, can you please try to understand what happened to this mystery? Because you and I were talking earlier, if we solve MH370, we haven't solved the larger problem that MH370 is just an instance of, which is the inability to understand what the hell is going on. We have the tools, but we're not using them to understand the world so that we can make it not be terrible. We want to control our circumstances. We can only do that if we understand how the world works. And if things happen and we're just like, I don't know. And this has happened again and again.
This is the spoof theory. In interest of fairness, I have to bring up the open questions with this theory, like we did for the other theories. And I want to hear from the horse's mouth itself why this would not work well. Okay. One of the reasons, I guess, people didn't agree with you, and you're going to hate me for this.
Okay.
But there is a tendency in this country to blame everything on the Russians, right? Let me expand on this point.
Yeah. Sure.
Something surprising happens with the election, Russian interference. There's a surprising war in the Middle East, Russian involvement. And later it is proved to be true, but there is an anti-Russian rhetoric in this country, and this theory definitely falls in that category.
Yeah, I mean, people have an anti-alligator bias in Florida. They're like, don't go into the water, you'll get bitten by an alligator. And people do keep getting on the water and getting bitten by alligators. A part of the persistence for the anti-alligator bias is the fact that people keep getting eaten by alligators. I think that there is an anti-Russian bias, but it is well-founded.
Okay. If there's some smoke, there has to be a fire.
Well, no, there's actual fire. There's there's smoke and there's fire, and you're actually on fire right now.
Well, let me bring up that point then. In the same year or within a year, Russia actually shot down another Malaysian Airlines flight.
Right.
So if they are at a stage where they don't mind just shooting down aircrafts, why construct this elaborate scheme where you can just in a straightforward way display your power like you mentioned?
I love that question. I think that's a great question. When you said you're going to hate me for asking this question, I thought what you're going to say was motive. What is the motive? And I mean, I think I have explained what I think sort of the thinking was behind this act. But ultimately, as we talked about with Zahari, you can't get into someone's mind. You don't really know what they're going. The theory that I was talking to an expert in espionage recently, and he was actually talking about how Putin and Russia were developing their capabilities post year 2000. And what was interesting to me that he said that I hadn't really heard before, which is that as soon as he developed these capabilities, he used them. As soon as he had the ability to invade Georgia, he did. He didn't develop a capability and then wait and do this sort of the art of war type strategizing about what's the best way to deploy it. This particular person was comparing China, which is very patient and sort of sees things in kind of centuries, famously, and Russia, which just seems very impulsive. And I was sort of imagining maybe Russia realized that they could do this cyber attack. And just the first chance he had to do it, the first time he had the least, the smallest motive to do it, he jumped on it and let's deploy it. There's no sense in having an arrow in your quiver if you don't shoot it at somebody, right? I think it kills, it's like me with a movie ticket coupon. It's the minute I can go see a movie, I'll see it even if it's not a very good movie, because I hate the idea of having it a wasting asset, right? Yeah. But ultimately, we don't know why people do things. But I do think it is extremely interesting. The analogy I sometimes draw is imagine you're a chicken farmer and you've never lost a chicken. And then one day you find a bloody, mangled chicken carcass. And then you're you have no idea who did it. And then 4 months later, you see a fox jump over the fence with a chicken in its mouth. Immediately, that first dead chicken makes a lot more sense, or you have a very compelling theory. So I've always thought that after MH17, we know that there's somebody that in 2014 was in the business of shooting down or doing malicious things to 777s. Who does this? Who does this? There were only 16 Malaysian Airlines 777s in the entire world out of 18,000 registered commercial aircraft. 16 out of 18,000. So the chances that randomly 2 different sets of aggressors were going to be taking on Malaysian Airlines 777s seems to me statistically unlikely.
Let's talk about the impulse that you brought up. It seems to me that this requires a heist of this nature requires such a lot of planning. You mentioned it has to be a 777, it has to have the electronics bay, the Honeywell system, whatever the system, and that system needs to be different. So much planning needs to go into this. Doing this a day after the sanctions were imposed on Russia just seems, it's an impulsive decision, but I feel it doesn't pay respect to the amount of planning that needs to go into this type of a heist.
Yeah.
Unless you're telling me they had this plan ready to go, locked and loaded.
So my first edition, I thought that there was an eerie coincidence between the fact that in both the case of MH370 and MH17, these events both occurred one day after the United States imposed sanctions, and the Russians said, in effect, there will be repercussions for these sanctions. And that kind of puts chills down my spine. But I think the issue you're raising is right. I mean, even if you had developed this idea and even if you had identified a target aircraft, it takes some time to get people on board the plane and work up your sort of cover stories and everything. So I don't know.
Another open question for you. If the plan was to make the plane disappear, why fly back over Malaysia, cross the military radar? Why fly across Penang? Why bank across Penang again?
So essentially my theory is that this was a magic trick. And the idea was that it was a deception my core idea is that MH370 was a deception. And a deception involves an A narrative that you want people to think is what happened, and a B narrative, which is what actually happened. So they had to pay attention to both. And so, if you really did want to just make a plane disappear, you would have kept flying straight after Igari and then just veered out to sea, Marianas Trench, etc.
Exactly.
Go out to sea, fly lower and lower, and before you're below anybody's radar, and so when you fly over the Air Force Base, you're like, hey, look at me, yada yada yada, look at me, So that's the explanation for that, I think.
And then there's another open question around, if you do take the north route, you cross the airspace of India, Pakistan, China, Nepal, Afghanistan. None of their radars detected anything. You've mentioned that this will require very skillful piloting where you go skirt the boundaries of the flight information regions. But even then, you have to suppose there's so much data, there's so many these countries are monitoring the airspace. Someone would have found something.
Yeah, that was one of the first reactions to my theory when I started talking about it. And I understand it. But the thing is that people really have an intuitive idea about radar coverage that isn't really accurate. Most of the world is not under primary radar coverage. It's expensive, it requires electricity and manpower. And if you're in a part of the world that is not at war with somebody, there is really no reason. Actually, I'm a little bit surprised that the Malaysian military had radar coverage. The Thais seem to have some radar coverage. The Indonesians, they might have had some radar coverage early, but then they turned it off after midnight. India has radar stations in the Andaman Islands. They have said that they were turned off. We don't know about other parts of India. One of the hot spots in the world on a continuing basis is India, Pakistan.
Yeah.
And this did not go completely near there. It went over a part of China that is near the Indian border. It's very underpopulated. It's kind of a black hole for aviation.
Also a contentious region of military conflict, actually. India and China have the border.
Absolutely. Aksai Chin, it's contested area, but it's also very, very difficult to operate there. So it's only So what you have happen is China will station some fighter jets there for a month, and then they'll pull it back. It is possible that there was radar on that would disprove the theory, but nobody has ever come out with that evidence. So I think until the evidence comes forward, we can't assume that it existed, if that makes sense.
And then this is a very weak open question, but if this was a third-party solution, as the hijacking is often being called, there had to be some way of signaling for help. So there's the passengers on board, there are pilots, there are so many ways where they can signal that they're in distress. Passengers have phones. 9/11, for example, when it was hijacked, many of the passengers actually sent text messages to their loved ones saying that something's wrong on the plane, they don't feel so good. It's even in the event where you depressurize the cabin, you do have a few minutes, I guess. We do have the pilots have an oxygen cylinder in the cockpit as well. There was no signal sent at any point for any help.
Again, I think this is an area where people assume that something is possible, more possible than it really is. I mean, one of the really intriguing data points about this case is that as the plane was flying probably around 35,000 feet over Penang, there was a connection between the co-pilot's cell phone and a cell phone tower on Penang. A lot of people are surprised by that because it isn't socially possible. I think that in the case of 9/11, maybe the plane was lower. I don't really know the details on that. I'm not an expert in cell phone connection technology, but I think if you incapacitated people at altitude and you weren't so near a cell phone tower, it's an interesting point, actually. It is an interesting point. By the way, if you were carrying out this attack and you wanted to be really sure that that didn't happen, there are local cell phone jammers that you can use that would sort of make it completely impossible. Yeah. So that might be. I think this is one of these areas where that could be something, but.
For those interested, there are many other crazy notions, and I just want to name some of those crazy notions. There are some that involve U.S. involvement, the United States shooting it down the South China Sea. There's the Diego Garcia military base. There's the Australian Butterworth military base and Australia's heavy involvement in the search as well when they were trying.
Right.
No good deed goes unpunished, right?
Right,
So if you look
right,
for the plane,
right.
you're probably at fault. There are also theories that involve UFOs, aliens, black holes, wormholes, some of my favorite ones.
Well, no, I mean, I think you might as well all put them in the same basket because I think they all have about the same amount of evidence.
Okay. We rated all the other theories. How much would you rate your own?
I mean, yeah, of course I'm biased, but I think that I don't know. 8. Here's the thing. We have to, I'm not really here to try to convince people that it's right. I really want to convince people that they should take it seriously. And I think the environment has changed a lot since 2014 in that, I mentioned earlier, we know that Russia has been engaged in a wide-ranging gray zone war where they're carrying out all kinds of nefarious activity. We know that. What also has changed is that we now know that the civil aviation sector is wide open to cyber attack. The Iranians commandeered a US drone in 2011 and were able to use GPS spoofing to bring it down and capture it and actually reverse engineer the technology and make their own drones. Yeah. Major defeat for the United States. We have seen cases where Russia is using GPS spoofing to divert planes off course without their flight crew realizing it until they do realize it. None of these have resulted in tragedy yet, as we know it. But I want people to take seriously the idea that cyber security is a real and valid issue for airplanes, civil aviation, and we need to take it seriously. Things are starting to be done. It's an interesting fact that in the aftermath of MH370, the FAA commissioned a report from a Washington think tank to assess the cyber vulnerability of the U.S. civil aviation fleet. That report came back in August of 2014 and said that there was like a huge number of vulnerabilities. And so I'm working on an article for Vanity Fair right now that's about all of the different ways that these cybersecurity vulnerabilities exist and that have been taken advantage of so far. But there's a lot of ways that a bad actor who is, as I said, aggressive, sophisticated, and ruthless can cause a lot of harm and a lot of disruption. I posited that we know that whoever took MH370 was sophisticated, aggressive, and ruthless. We know that there was an actor at that time who had intent to do us harm that was aggressive, ruthless, and the other thing that I said. So we have to, it's like your house is on fire. It's not like where there's smoke, there's fire. There's fire. We know there's fire. We should really act like it.
So you gave an 8 out of 10 to your own theory. If you keep your own theory aside, what would be the next most plausible one?
It would be the pilot.
The one that you gave 1 out of 10. So that's the gulf.
I mean,
that's the gulf between the next.
I've often imagined that Ocean Infinity says we're going to restart the search, and then they find it. And then I'm going to be like, okay, what the hell? Because there's all these problems that you would have to resolve with the theory. Like, what is the explanation? What will the explanation turn out to be? Something actually, there is a narrative that of what actually occurred to this plane. And so, and as I said, it generated all this evidence that we have came from this actual event. And so how you map those two things, the actual event to the evidence that we have and know about, maybe some of the evidence we think we have is actually wrong. Maybe somebody really did get into Zahari's flight simulator and fake it or something. There's going to be surprises. That's inevitable. But I'm not here to say that there's not another possibility, but I do. The point I'm trying to make is that, to me, solving MH370 is less important than understanding the environment in which it occurred. So even if Zahari took the plane, the fact still remains that you have a very aggressive, dangerous actor who is doing us harm as we speak. And I hesitate to say this because it's going to become obsolete very quickly. But as I'm speaking to you in August of 2024, we are facing the very real possibility that Donald Trump will become president again. He is an ally of Vladimir Putin, and essentially the war that I believe Putin launched against the West in 2014 will have been won by Putin. So this is not an imaginary thing. This is not an abstract thing. What I'm trying to tell you is that even if I'm completely wrong about who took the plane, there is enough about it that smells like aggressive Russian gray zone warfare that we really need to worry about this. And yes, Russian involvement in the 2016 election was not a hoax. The constant conservative and right-wing misinformation about that fact is itself a conspiracy, a real conspiracy. Conspiracies are real and they're being carried out. And people who say, oh, that's all just conspiracy theory, this is the tangled web that we find ourselves in. We're trying to make sense of the world at a time where people are actively trying to pull the rug out underneath our feet all the time.
In a blog post that you wrote about the season finale of your podcast, you said the following words: MH370 is in so many ways a microcosm of the world we live today. And by understanding its causes and effects, we can better understand how to navigate a complex and sometimes dangerous world. I find that powerful because this is not just any other mystery you're trying to solve. Just by studying this case, you get to see, you in a way wake up to the intricacies of the complex mechanics of the entire world. I know I've learned so much about just the world in general, about like how flights work, about radars, about country political conflicts, just by studying this.
Well, me too. I mean, I'm really delighted you said that. To me, MH370 has been like a college education. I've learned about the life cycle of the Lepus antityphra barnacle. I've learned about how satellite communication systems work. I've learned about the data bus of a 777, all these things.
You rated some crazy notions. You were part of the Netflix documentary MH370, The Plane That Disappeared. And one of the criticisms, and you brought this up as well, of that documentary was that it gave a platform to many conspiracy theories and it sensationalized the case. Where do you stand on this? So if you ask me personally, I'm a bit conflicted because when you see these type of mysteries become entertainment, a part of me feels like it's insensitive to the tragedy. People have lost their lives. Families have lost partners, mother, fathers, children. I'm fully cognizant. I'm doing the same thing today. I'm creating an episode which, to a certain extent, I guess you could put some entertainment value to it. So I'm fully cognizant of that. I think, yeah, a part of me is slightly uncomfortable with that. But there's the other part of me can make that case. And that's the reason, the motivation behind making this episode as well, is that if you make it entertaining, if you sensationalize it, that's the best way to reach a mass audience, get people hooked onto it. And the more people that are hooked onto it, they have the motivation to put that pressure on the authorities, continue the investigation. You can reach a much wider audience. Where do you stand on this? Is there a fine line to walk, or are you clearly in one camp?
I think you've 100% hit the nail on the head. I think you're raising actually a really good point that I don't know if I've ever heard articulated with such clarity. I went into this mystery thinking that MH370 would be a hard mystery to solve. That turned out to be the easiest part. The really hard part of MH370 is getting people to engage with it enough to try to explain it. And yeah, I have to not only solve this mystery, but then kind of do a song and dance and be entertaining enough in discussing it that I can sort of slowly like get the audience to take the time and effort to understand what's happening. And that is a huge challenge. I'm here with you. You and I are similar in many ways. I mean, we're trying to create a show that people will want to watch by being hopefully intelligent, by bringing real value. I said you have an incredible roster of guests. You're clearly motivated to shed light on things. And that is, I think, a noble undertaking. The fact that you have to be entertaining while doing it is like makes it twice as difficult. But hey, we have to do it because we have to do it. If it's incredibly possible and like maybe beyond our capabilities. I don't know if I'm ever going to succeed in getting people to take this threat seriously. I know that many people think we're at a sort of extinction level event when it comes to Western liberal democracy. And so I'm just one voice in a whole tidal wave, I think, of alarm and concern. But yeah, it is. You raise a really fascinating point. We're trying to be entertaining And we're fighting against people who are being entertaining with stuff that's just really dumb. They're not burdened. We're actually trying to, it's like trying to run a foot race where you've got this lead ball attached to your leg because you're trying to actually make a point that has some value and purpose in the world. And you're competing against people who do not care. They will literally say, and here's the other thing. The internet lets you see all the data about how it lands. So you can see, oh, people want to hear that. Like one of the guys that's getting a ton of views about MH370 is the guy who says he's got video of the UFO taking it into a transdimensional portal. He doesn't have to worry about understanding the case or making sense of it. So that's what we're against.
This is, a confusion I battle with as well, but I know that if we can keep it entertaining, keep this relevant in people's minds, then I think it's probably for the better. The moment people forget about it, the people who try to do this, they have won, I feel.
Abraham Lincoln talked about the better angels of our nature. And I think that there is something really entertaining about understanding how the world really works. And I think that we can build something that people can get excited about by using a sense of having a sense of, what's the word? I would love to, I wish I had the word that I'm talking about. The sense of doing things for the right reason. We want to, we live in a world that is so cynical in so many regards. And we want to be the opposite of that. We want to build a world that's not cynical, that actually we help each other and we try to help each other understand things so that we can get what we want to achieve collectively, and I think that we can, but only if we really fight. And so here we are.
You are building something for the right reason. And this will be my final big question. Let's talk about the future. You're working on a project that's going to launch a replica Flaperon in the Southern Indian Ocean. What is this project? What are you trying to achieve? What questions might that answer?
I think that there's a potential smoking gun that we have already with MH370, which we talked briefly about the Flaperon, the first piece of debris that washed ashore and was recovered. The first piece is the most informative because it has the shortest distance to work backwards to where the plane's presumed impact site was. And so this Flaperon allowed the authorities to do reverse drift modeling and so forth. And yet, when we look at the Flaperon, I said earlier that when you get this evidence, a key characteristic of it is that none of it matches with each other. And with the Flaperon, one of the first things that the authorities noticed when they took it into the lab was that it didn't float the way it should have, in the sense that the entire thing was covered with these barnacles called Lepus antitifera that grow underwater. So the fact that it was completely covered in these underwater organisms suggested that the whole thing was underwater. However, when they put it in a tank, it floated half or 1/3. It was out. There was a part of it that was never underwater, and yet that part was covered in barnacles. How? That's a contradiction. That's a paradox. Another paradox is that the barnacles were way smaller than you expect, given how long this thing was in the water. The barnacles looked like they were maybe 2 or 3 months old, not 15 months old. So what I would like to do is put a Flaperon in the water and watch it float, maybe put cameras on it so you can even see the marine life growing on it. And hopefully after 15 months, recover it so you can compare how these barnacles grew versus on the Flaperon. And also see whether it covers all of the Flaperon or not. And I think that if we have this hard data, and there's, a good theory allows you to make predictions, and a good experiment, you can predict how it will turn out. So there's two. Either this piece will have a water line, meaning there will be part of it that doesn't have barnacles on it, or it won't. And if this piece if after 15 months, this piece that we put in the water is completely covered in Lepus antitifera particles, we've essentially destroyed a paradox. We've eliminated that paradox. And frankly, it makes it sort of makes it seem more likely that the piece really did go in the water at the crash site and the plane really did crash in the Southern Indian Ocean. However, if it doesn't, if it does not have barnacles growing above the waterline, and those barnacles are the ones that do grow on it are substantially larger, I think we have actual concrete physical evidence that the plane did not go into the Southern Indian Ocean and that debris was planted. And I think it will be exciting for people to know that for the first time in 11 years, we have new evidence about the fate of this plane, and evidence that, frankly, I think is dispositive as to what happened to it. So I need to raise some money to buy a Flaperon. They cost like $15,000 or something. So I'm in the process with help of one of the wonderful things about having a podcast and interacting with readers and listeners and viewers is that people pitch in and help. So I'm really encouraging people to join. I'm going to probably do a Substack or something like that so that people can chip in money, chip in their ideas. And I would love, another thing we can do is there are all these global drifters that are floating around the ocean all the time. I want to recover some of them and take Lepus barnacles off of there, because those drifters all have location data and temperature data. So we can actually have for the first time, be able to use these Lepus barnacles as a calibrated data tracking device, essentially.
Where is the piece now, actually?
The Flaperon is in Toulouse, France.
Oh.
Yeah, the French. La Réunion is a French island, so they had it.
And they have not been able to identify whether it was submerged for a while, then broke off, and then had the other barnacles. They were not able to find that data on it. Like what's below the waterline.
Nobody has been able to explain that. I mean, I was talking to a guy in my podcast who's like, maybe there was a net on top of it, but I don't think a net is gonna, first of all, how's the net get on top of it? And secondly, a net wouldn't hold it down.
Was it submerged for a while, then it like broke off and then
People
floated.
have floated all kinds of ideas like that.
Yeah.
They don't really work.
Okay.
For various reasons.
Okay. Well, if you want to support this project, you know how to reach out to Jeff. All the links will be there. Let's move into some of our closing questions.
Okay.
Before we go there, I would love it if you can tell me what I've built.
What you built. I have failed to build something. I started to build something, but I can't think and do anything else at the same time. This is a robot. He is going to defend the Earth against the bad guys. And this is a lovely Italian villa.
Ooh.
And it's on the coast, and it's lovely.
A robot defending Earth in an Italian villa. This is my art.
Well, what was your intention?
It's all random,
abstract?
but
Okay.
I can see the robot and I can see the Italian modern villa that I was building. Final question.
Okay.
What are some books, movies, role models that have strongly influenced you in your life?
Wow. I wish I had a better answer for this, but I will just say this, that I'm reading Blindness by Jose Saramago right now, Portuguese Nobel Prize winning author. And it's just a delight. You know, I spend so much time reading nonfiction and reading about Bayesian inference and that kind of thing, that it's really a treat and a delight to just read a beautifully observed, carefully crafted novel that kind of transports me into a completely different world where none of this stuff happens. So I will say that it's not, I mean, I'm not like doing Jose Saramago any favors. I think he's appreciated enough, but it's just nice to have a sort of something nice.
Movie and role model.
Oh, I have to keep going. Movie, you know, I have a 15-year-old son who is really interested in filmmaking, and it's been a real delight to go to the Jacob Burns Film Center in Pleasantville, New York, and see all kinds of movies. Yeah. And when you've seen some wonderful ones there, my son Rem is thinking about doing a documentary, and it's hard to imagine a world that doesn't have the Werner Herzog documentary about the bear getting eaten by a bear. That's just an incredible Bearman? What's it called? Bearman? Anyway, that's a great documentary. That is like a truly, I think, it kind of changed the way I saw the world. And then role model. I recently have been reading documentaries, I've recently been reading biographies of the young men who unraveled the mystery of quantum mechanics. And I just think that that Paul Dirac and his contemporaries were just astonishing. I mean, as a feat of the human mind, from just some simple physical principles, derive a kind of underlying structure of how the universe works. I don't think you can really top that as an intellectual feat, but it's also kind of a cautionary tale, because very quickly after these brilliant men discovered how the universe works, that knowledge was used to make the atomic bomb. And so to understand really at a profound level how the universe works, and then the ability to destroy life following from that is really cautionary. I think really common. I was just also in the south of Portugal where Henry the Navigator, basically learned how to sail the world. And that knowledge allowed us to have the world that we live in today. All of the things, the interconnectedness, the fact that I can have Indian food for dinner and Thai food for lunch, and I can do a Zoom call with somebody in Kazakhstan. All of those things spring from Henry the Navigator and figuring out how to go travel around the world. The first thing the Portuguese did, the first place they discovered was West Africa. The first thing they did was to enslave the people that lived there. So this idea that there's sort of this binary nature of technology and discovery seems to be kind of deep baked in, and we have to really, it's not easy being a human being.
Interesting you brought up the young men behind quantum physics. I actually have an episode, I'm going to have another episode about it. We had spoken about motives and psychology. It's crazy when you find out how much nefarious motives there are in quantum physics itself between Schrodinger, Niels Bohr, and Louis de Broglie and Bohmian mechanics, and how they try to hide a certain interpretation and promote a certain one.
It's fascinating.
Which explains why physics is in a standstill at the moment. Anyway, not opening that can of worms.
It's a good one though.
Fantastic list. I promised you almost 2 hours ago, feels like 15 years ago,
right,
that I'm going to park aside 2 questions.
Okay.
And as we close out, I want to revisit those questions.
Okay.
We started this talking about this near-death experience that you had when you were nearly knocked out. And one thing you said that was very interesting was one of like a very profound moment in your life is when you realize it's going to go away, when death comes into the picture. How has your work changed your perspective on your death, your mortality? When you study all these stories, you study all these people and different motives, you come across the transient nature of life, the futility of life sometimes. Right. How's that changed your perspective on your own death and your own mortality?
I haven't made any progress whatsoever. I mean, okay. I feel that I'm starting to realize that it is, I don't think there is any purchase we can get as human beings on that question. I mean, I think the original question I had for myself was, is there a way that I can somehow enlighten myself? I loved reading Hermann Hesse, Siddhartha, about like, can you somehow, is there such a thing as enlightenment? And I'm fascinated by this idea that in the year 2024, this idea of enlightenment, which is such a profound idea in so many religions, there's no that I'm aware of, no neurobiological research into like this state. Is there like, what if there were a state where you would like actually achieve transcendence?
Yeah.
I haven't seen any kind of, physical corollaries of the experience of transcendence. Wouldn't that be amazing? I don't think it exists. Listen, I mean, but at the same time, I'll tell you what, it's not working on MH370, it's having kids. Having kids, you see, oh my God, there really are miracles. I'm an atheist, right? But then I experienced a miracle. It's a paradox. How did this, the most incredible, the most impressive thing I've ever done in my life was something that I did like in an act of like, as a drunken mistake. It wasn't a mistake, but you get what I'm saying. The hardest thing you did was like, because of something you did like carelessly. I think you understand what I'm saying.
Of course.
And so you see, to have yourself confronted with that miracle, it again reawakened that feeling, that sort of feeling of like encountering that imponderable. And so then you do realize, yeah, I'm dying, but like, I'm also in a way immortal, like something, I'm an expression of something. Look, I didn't exert any effort to exist. I just suddenly existed. I just woke up this morning and here I was, effortless. So why am I worried about losing it? You know what I mean? But I still will freak out when I'm in that turbulence, I will freak out again.
The smallest amount of turbulence, my first thought is, this is how I go. This is it. This is how the story ends.
Ready.
In that spirit, what would you like your legacy to be? How do you want to be remembered?
I would like people to understand the power that they have over their lives and their fate and their destiny. This is another project that I hope that if I can have some success in people helping people understand this, they might say, maybe we should listen to him about something else. And the other thing I really want to talk about is I want to do actually a follow-on series about control theory and how it applies to your own life. Militaries, governments, large businesses, they have a very well-defined protocol for achieving things that they want to do. And when they set a goal, they, by God, do it. A lot of people who actually work in those corporations and actually implement those policies on behalf of the corporation don't apply them to their own lives.
Right.
People have so much power over their own lives that they don't use because they don't understand the components of the process. So I would love to live long enough that I can actually get this book published, talk about it, do a podcast about it. I think it's really important that people collectively work for their own individual and collective good. And this kind of gets back to the idea of why I'm so worried about this existential threat to Western democratic society, is that there is a way that we can work for the greater good, and we are being attacked by an alternative society that is cynical and will destroy all that. And so I hope that we can go the good way and not the bad way.
I hope so. We spent a couple of hours talking about motives, human psychology. We have covered suffering, grief, maybe even the nature of evil. We've spoken about pain, lots and lots of pain. It's been depressing. I promise I'll park aside a question you mentioned right in the beginning. So let's go back to it as a final question.
Yeah.
You had spoken about what is this thing life is. We're talking about this near-death experience. After this conversation that we've had, help me, Jeff Weiss. Help me see the light at the end of the tunnel. What is this thing called life? What is the meaning of life? Is there hope? What does this all mean?
I think I wish we could talk about it and think about it a lot more, because I think it's really interesting and it's right accessible in front of us all the time. I think there's a really important and basic fact that's kind of obvious and yet we never talk about it, which is that there's two separate realities. There's the reality of hard wood and stone, and there's the lived experience, the Rene Descartes, I think therefore I am. One comes from the other and actually goes back. We talk about emergent phenomena. It also is like emergent. It goes the other way. For the contents of my experience in my brain, the part that writes poetry and has conversations like this, it's also affecting the world of molecules, right? So Descartes famously guessed that might had something to do with the pineal gland.
There's got to be theater. There's a man in the pineal gland.
Yeah. So this is a really interesting question. I wish we could talk about it more. What is the connection? First of all, the fact that when you have a dream, that dream didn't happen. That's not the same thing as Jesus telling you something, right? It's not, God is not telling you something. It's internal to you and it's in your brain. That is entirely something that you alone experience. So I would, I forget what the question was, but basically I think that
meaning of life.
The meaning of life. I do think there is, we should address that. One of the really things I think about all the time is this experience of the right now, is that permanent or ephemeral? Because maybe us sitting here right now, is as timeless as the square root of pi. It's a feature of the universe that exists in some kind of abstract, n-dimensional space, concept space. You know what I'm saying? And this gets very heady and sort of starts to seem like undergraduate midnight rambling after a while. But it's real. And I think this is kind of lies. And I sometimes tell myself, I was actually lying by the swimming pool yesterday with my arm in the water thinking there's a kind of thought that you have, that I have, where I think I'm here right now. I'm doing that thing where I'm here. And there's certain things that when I'm doing that thing, I always think this is real, this is right now. And I wonder, is that feeling of that awareness, that sort of, when you turn the spotlight on yourself, you turn the spotlight inward, is that somehow I don't know, is that the goal of life? Maybe that's what all we're here for. There's some people that talk about we are just the universe. We are the universe's experience of itself. And that whatever the relationship is between the wiring of our brain and the subjective experience of the universe that we feel, that is common to all of us. So the same machinery that's making you feel like you is making me feel like me. And so basically it's the same thing, but it only ever experiences itself in the individual case. It's the same thing though. And that means you're effectively immortal. Which is, you know, nice. The other, because the other alternative is like, we're just fleeting. I kind of, you know what I would love to do as a project? I would love to go through all of world history and literature and get all of the poems where the person says, I'm alive and I'm going to die. And I'm here right now. And I think you can go back thousands of years and find people expressing that thought. And I think that's a wonderfully unifying thought. And like maybe at some deep level, like the most common, like unifying thought that we all have. And, you know, it's kind of weird to like read a poem from like 600 AD. And this person saying like, I'm drinking my wine, I'm looking at the moon, I'm going to die. And like, how is that different from what I'm experiencing right now? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So the question is it ephemeral or is it permanent? I don't know. I'd like to think of, I do like to think about it though.
I came to you for answers. You've given me 20 other questions about physicalism, about the hard problem of consciousness,
right.
about Descartes, the Cartesian theater, the homunculus.
Right.
All fascinating questions. I love these questions, but yeah, definitely something to think about. Jeff, if people want to connect with you, if they want to support your project, if they want to find out more about your work, what is the best place to find you?
Finding MH370.com. It's the show page. It has the videos that are on YouTube. You can reach out to me there. I love to engage with people. I love to answer people's questions. People can also ask each other questions. With this project, What the Flaperon, which I'm just in the stages of getting off the ground, I really hope to really make that community more directly connected, you know, because I do think that there are many people who carry passion, who care passionately about this subject. And I would love for them to feel that they were walking with a group of people to find an answer.
It's a beautiful vision. Jeff, this is one of the longest episodes I've done, but it's been a breeze. I think it's been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much.
Listen, I'm extremely grateful to you for your erudition and, you know, the work that you put into it, because it is really pretty impressive, actually. So, and, you know, listen, it's people like you that make the world like continue to exist in a way that we want to live in it. You know what I mean? So thank you for doing what you do.